All right, this is our next lecture as we build up to the outbreak of the Civil War. This one is going to cover some of the more immediate causes of it because we've been covering the build-up, a lot of the sectional tension, how the North and South are drifting apart, and how slavery and territorial expansion has played a role in that drift. This is going to really exacerbate that. Some of the new things that come up that really start to split the North and the South and initiate the war because you can have a lot of sectional tension that doesn't necessarily mean that the country is destined for civil war, but it does end up happening. So that's what we're going to trace today is how indeed all of the sectional tension finally bubbles over and turns into an incredibly deadly conflict. That's why I always like to refer to this lecture as the impending crisis, because a crisis is indeed what is on the horizon for the United States. So it's all still looped into territorial expansion, a lot of this tension, and the issues with expanding the United States further west, adding more states to the Union, and that never-ending question of should these new territories be added as states to the Union as free states or as slave states? And a lot of this turmoil really is centered in Kansas and Nebraska, the territory that will become the states of Kansas and Nebraska. And looking at this, we first have to look at some of the issues that arise here, starting out with Stephen Douglas, who's pictured there pointing to the right. He was an Illinois senator, and he was very much in favor of westward expansion. He believed that the United States really needed to expand west, and he felt that it was being hindered very heavily by this constant debate over free or slave and that it was too cumbersome to really keep adding the same amount of states every time. He just wants to see more states added to the union. And his suggestion, his platform to how to expedite this and make it go faster is to adopt a popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is a method of determining something just by vote. The population is sovereign, and they are the ones who cast their ballots and, in a very democratic way, decide the outcome of things. And this was something that had been brought up in the Compromise of 1850, the idea that future debates over states entering as free or slave states should be solved by a vote, by the vote of the people living there. Okay, there's a bunch of people living in a territory that wants to become a state. You have an election. They vote whether the state enters the union as a free state or a slave state. That solves the problem right then and there. Just let the people decide. It seems very, very democratic, very above board. And Stephen Douglas is a huge advocate for this. He advocates for the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which is a bill that introduces that idea of letting the question of the Kansas-Nebraska territory's status as a free or slave state be determined by the residents that are living there. And this was supposed to just solve the problem of westward expansion and expedite settlement. So it becomes law. That means the question of Kansas's status, Nebraska's status, all the status of these potential states, whether they're free or slave, will be determined by a vote of the people living there. And it's also around this time that the Republican Party emerges. We start to see the two names that we're familiar with in modern politics come about, Republican Party and Democrat Party. The Democrats are in favor of slavery as long as it's people's choice. They are mostly Southerners are Democrats. Remember, Andrew Jackson was a Democrat, and they are keen on this idea of solving the issue via popular sovereignty. But the opposition to the Democrats had been kind of fractured for a while. You remember the opposition was the Whigs, WHIG, Whig. And after the whole John Tyler incident, the executive ass kind of ruined it. They'd been a bit adrift, but now they're coalescing around a new party label and a new party platform. They're calling themselves Republicans, and the Republicans are united behind stopping slavery because even if they don't oppose it on moral grounds, they just think that the South is getting a little too powerful. And Republicans are on the rise because now they have something cohesive to join around. Opposition to spreading slavery. They don't like the idea of popular sovereignty to decide this. A lot of them feel that it's just the South is going to get its way. They're going to become violent with this. It's the elections will never be fair. they don't like how easy it seems for the South to get away with this and to continue to spread slavery. All right, first question, what was the purpose of the Kansas-Nebraska Act? And indeed, I mentioned the Republican Party is on the rise. They're tightening their platform around opposition to expansion of slavery, and they feel that the popular sovereignty thing simply won't work because the elections are going to be illegitimate and fraught with peril, and they are proven correctly pretty quickly because once it the Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes law, and that's how we're going to settle the free or slave state question in Kansas. The elections are indeed quite fraught. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas in 1854, 1855 because the elections that were held to determine the legality of slavery or whether or not this would be a slave state ends up descending into a state of almost civil war. It's seen as a bit of a proto-civil war because it's between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people trying to fight over whether or not the institution will continue. Essentially, with Bleeding Kansas, what happens is they're going to hold their vote. They're going to determine slavery or no slavery, and a lot of pro-slavery planters and supporters of slavery from across the border in Missouri and other slave states just flood into the Kansas territory, absolutely dead set and determined to sway this election. Anti-slavery people do it too. They flood into Kansas to cast their ballot to oppose slavery. So it becomes very difficult to determine if popular sovereignty can even work because was that really the sentiment of the people living there? You've had people from both sides flood into the area to try to sway the ballot in what they believe in. A lot of it were the pro-slavery advocates coming in. They end up fighting each other. It gets extremely violent. They're killing over 200 people are killed in the Bleeding Kansas riots and violent actions during all these votes. And eventually there were so many pro-slavery advocates that poured over the border to cast fraudulent ballots in Kansas that it does lead to a majority, and the president at the time, Franklin Pierce, accepts it, and Kansas is going to be accepted as a slave state. I mentioned over 200 people were killed. There's also a sacking of a city. That's what's pictured here. The city of Lawrence, Kansas, it was an attack. It was a free soil stronghold where a lot of anti-slavery people lived, and the pro-slavery forces attack it, burn it down. You can see the destroyed buildings. So there's a lot of violence on this, and it seemed to prove the Republicans right that the popular sovereignty was not going to work because too many people were going to try to sway the ballot, and it was going to descend into utter violence and chaos. All right, next question. What was Bleeding Kansas? So we talked about how Republicans are sort of coalescing around this anti-slavery, anti-South sentiment. And the Bleeding Kansas issue would show them that the South was indeed very violent. And there's another issue, another incident that happens in 1856 that seems to highlight that even further, that the South is extremely violent, especially when it comes to slavery, that they are not an entity that you can reason with or have any sort of rational discourse with anymore. So you had Bleeding Kansas, that was a very violent episode, 1854, 1855. Now, 1856, there's going to be another incident that seems to prove without a doubt to the North and to anybody who is against slavery that the South is indeed beyond reason at this point. And that is the caning of a Northern senator named Charles Sumner by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks. And this event, I'll give you a little bit of background about what this event is, how it unfolds. Basically, in 1856, Senator Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts, and he was an anti-slavery Republican and addressed the Senate that year about how disgusting he felt slavery was and the spread of slavery was. He rails against the South and rails against slave owners. He calls slavery a mistress who is beautiful to the South but ugly to others, and that it's kind of like he imbues it with this sense of depravity and that slavery is a harlot that corrupts men and makes them just absolutely disgusting. And he just goes on and on about how bad slavery is. And he calls out a couple Southerners for their connection to the institution. And one of them was a South Carolinian named Andrew Butler. And Charles Sumner goes off about how bad he is too, and uh, just keeps talking about how disgusting slavery is and everybody who supports it is disgusting and this is morally wrong and it's spreading and it's corrupting the nation. And Preston Brooks of South Carolina was related to Andrew Butler, who Sumner had badmouthed. So Preston Brooks, being a strong Southern man, decides he's going to stand up for his family's honor. And after Charles Sumner made his remarks, Brooks enters his chambers afterwards and just starts wailing on him with a cane. Other people see it, it's witnessed. They draw this is a very famous cartoon that appears in several magazines and publications where Preston Brooks of South Carolina just absolutely bashes Senator Sumner. He really injures him very, very, very bad with this cane. I don't think Sumner, from the reports I've heard, of some primary sources, Sumner never really recovers from this. He gets injured pretty badly and he's not very effective as a political leader. He's forced to go back to Massachusetts and recover there from this attack. And it makes the news because, I mean, a congressman wailing on a senator with a stick would always make news, but it's just becomes an absolute national sensation, the caning of Sumner. And it really furthers the North's argument that the South is incredibly violent. Always just want to make sure you're comfortable with this, that this is something that the North really heavily reacts to. This cartoon is very clearly one that is against Brooks. It shows him as sort of this violent attacker. You know, he's not even showing his face in this. The cartoon blots it out. He's got this big stick. He's absolutely wailing on this poor defenseless man here who's holding a quill and he's not even fighting back. People in the background are experiencing every single one of the seven stages of grief looking at this. He's seen as Sumner is definitely seen as the bigger man, the more chivalrous uh, intellectual here, just being at the mercy of this violent, nasty, brutish South. And it becomes representative of the country as a whole, that the North is being beat up by the South because the South is a giant bully. And every time you bring up slavery and try to talk to them about it, this is how they react. They are totally unreasonable and extremely violent. This is building on a long string of violence, too. We talked about the things that happened to William Lloyd Garrison and the death of Elijah Lovejoy trying to protect his printing press. Bleeding Kansas, now you have Southern congressmen beating up senators. The North is getting very tired of the things that the South are doing. They view the South now as a whole as just very uncivilized, not open to debate, willing to defend slavery at any cost, and extremely troublesome. Southerners are, they're some of them are kind of proud of this. They're thinking, yeah, he stood up for his family. He showed that weakling what's what. He wasn't going to let him badmouth anybody. It's supposedly rumor has it that afterwards a group of delegates gave Preston Brooks a new cane because he'd broken it, how hard he beat up Sumner, that had engraved in it, hit him again. So there were some support on the side of the South for having stood up for his honor and stood up for the Southern economy. But on the whole, this has a really outsized impact on the North, and they feel quite devastated with how far things have gotten and how violent things have become. All right, next question here. How did Northerners feel about the caning of Charles Sumner? So the South is becoming increasingly violent, and Northerners are also going to start becoming worried about how the South's interest in protecting slavery is becoming more and more ensconced in national law. And they're going to be quite worried about how protected slavery is getting. They had really, a lot of Northerners, regardless of their moral feelings, had kind of hoped that just in general, slavery was going to die out. That was a lot of the individuals involved in the Constitution had begrudgingly accepted that compromise to allow the South to continue with slavery, with the idea that maybe one day it'll just go away on its own, but it doesn't seem to be doing that. It seems to be getting larger and more heavily protected and more fortified as an institution. And one example of this is the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott v. Sanford, which was a Supreme Court case that has its ruling announced in 1857. So we're going very chronologically year by year of things that are very troublesome to the North and making this conflict seem almost inevitable to some. So a little bit of background on Dred Scott. Dred Scott is pictured here. He was an enslaved man, and in sort of the early 1830s, Scott and his family were in living in Missouri and they were enslaved there. And in 1833 to 1845, Scott and his family were enslaved by a white family, and that family took them up to Illinois, which was a free state at the time, and when there were still the free and slave state distinctions. And after having lived there in 1846, Scott decides to sue for freedom, saying, I lived in a free state that should make me and my family all free. So it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court because, boy, nobody really thought of that one before. And in March of 1857, the Supreme Court announces its rulings on the Dred Scott case, and they rule that no, Dred Scott is not free for having lived in a free state because blacks were not citizens. They could not sue or expect any type of protection from the federal government. The other result of the Supreme Court case was that they double down on the fact that Congress should not and could not have any authority to ban slavery anywhere. They could not say that slavery was illegal, that was above their jurisdiction, that was up to the states, so they weren't getting any further involved in the illegality of slavery. And they make it they make it part of legal precedent that banning the spread of slavery or attempting to take away someone's slave property was unconstitutional. So the result of the Dred Scott case was a massive victory for slave owners in the South. It sets a precedent that even living in free states does not make enslaved Americans free. It solidifies the protections of slave property for Southerners, and it declares enslaved Americans non-citizens that are not entitled to any of the rights or protections that Americans enjoy, no matter where it is that they live. So Northerners are also just horrified by this too. They're thinking, oh no, now the Supreme Court seems to be taking the side of Southerners and slave owners and making it almost impossible for this institution to be extracted from our society. They're doubling down. It's getting worse. So there is a sense of growing trepidation in the North that things are going in the wrong direction. And the violence they see in Bleeding Kansas and the caning of Sumner and the very disappointing outcome of the Dred Scott case just all seems to be adding up to a very powerful South that is getting its way and building a protective wall around slavery. Their hopes of it going away seems to be diminishing with every case like this and every instance of violence. All right, next question. What was the outcome of the Dred Scott v. Sanford case? And now we're going to look at some politics here. So, on this scene, this very fraught violence political scene becomes a politician who had been fairly unknown to this point, named Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was a very little known legislator, originally from Kentucky. He grew up on the frontier area of Illinois, Indiana, and he hadn't been very successful in politics. He tried a couple times, but wasn't working out for poor Abe here. And in 1854, after all of the violence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, Abraham Lincoln decides he needs to get back into politics because things are going very poorly. He does not like to see the spread of slavery. He is very much against slavery as an institution, and thinks he needs to try to do something to curtail it if he can. A big thing for Abraham Lincoln was he absolutely despised how much slavery gave enemies of the United States ammunition against them. Like it made the United States seem like such massive, massive hypocrites. And Lincoln just saw this as a stain on the reputation of America and was very hopeful that slavery could gradually be dismissed, that it would sort of gradually die out. And all of these other things happening, the South just really getting very protective of it, Dred Scott case, bleeding Kansas, Lincoln's getting worried. He's seeing what other Northerners and anti-slavery advocates see, and that's a growth and entrenchment of slavery, not it going away. So Lincoln re-enters politics and he starts to get more politically active as a Republican. And in 1858, Abraham Lincoln ends up challenging Stephen Douglas of Illinois for the Senate seat. Remember, Stephen Douglas, who was the one pointing in the first slide, he was a Democrat, very much in favor of just let the people decide. And they end up going at it in 1858 as they have a series of debates while they are campaigning for the Senate seat. And slavery, the topic of slavery, becomes a talking point between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. And their stances on slavery are quite different. Douglas's stance was that slavery was just fine, as just let the people decide, keep up with popular sovereignty, and that was how everything should be decided. If people want slavery, let them have it. If they don't want it, fine. We're not going to force it on anybody. He was fine with it as long as it was people's choice. And Douglas felt that it was not right for the government to get involved in moral issues. He felt that declaring slavery illegal or taking away people's slave property was not what the government should be doing. That was beyond the power of the government. It was too much. It was too much of a violation of personal liberty. Lincoln has a bit of the opposite stance here. He wants to see slavery go away. He thinks that popular sovereignty was a bad choice for slavery because slavery really was a poison for the nation, and by letting it spread like this was just horrible moral indifference. It was such a horrible sin that it needed to be taken away. You can't let people vote on this. It has to just go away. And Lincoln was of the position too that slavery breeds violence. It breeds violence like killing Elijah Lovejoy, like attacking William Lloyd Garrison, bleeding Kansas, caning Sumner. It's a violent institution initiated by violent individuals and it's destroying the nation. He thinks slavery should not spread at all. It has to stop spreading and retreat. It has to go away. However, Lincoln is unsuccessful in his bid for the Senate seat, and uh, Douglas is victorious again. He wins the election. But Abraham Lincoln doesn't disappear as a politician. He gets a lot of notoriety and attention after these debates and becomes kind of the poster boy for the Republican Party. He's very well liked, even by people who are kind of indifferent to slavery, because Lincoln's other stance is that the Union needs to stay together. He is terrified of the nation breaking apart and thinks that the country needs to do something to reestablish unity. Slavery is bad, but unity needs to remain. All right, next question. What were Lincoln's and Douglas's stances on slavery? So just how did each one of them feel about the institution of slavery? What were their views on it? But it's not all the South that is going to get violent about this. There are plenty of Northerners who think they need to meet the South where it stands and conduct a little violence of their own. And one of those individuals was John Brown. John Brown was a very radical abolitionist, a militant abolitionist, who was from the New England area, and he ended up taking part in a lot of the violence of Bleeding Kansas on the side of anti-slavery. John Brown is biblically inspired. He feels that it is his just divine destiny to get rid of slavery, and he is of the mind that slavery is going to, the only way it'll disappear is in a wash of blood. He is determined to kill anybody who opposes him and who supports slavery. He is really just fully convinced that it will be violence is the only answer to this because slavery is so entrenched and the Southerners are so violent that that's the only thing that they will listen to, and that's the only thing that will bring about change. He glorifies things like Nat Turner's Rebellion, where the enslaved preacher rose up and massacred several people, dozens of people. The Haitian Rebellion, where the enslaved Haitians rose up against the French colonizers. I mean, he sees that that is the rivers of blood, very Old Testament style ideas of just cleansing the sins with the blood type of stuff. When Bleeding Kansas occurs, he races over there to join in the violence on the side of the anti-slavery people, and he takes part in an event known as the Potawatomi Massacre, which was a retaliation for that sack on Lawrence. Remember the pro-slavery people burned Lawrence to the ground? So John Brown has some vengeance, and he gets together with some of his enormous family. He had like something like 12 or 15 kids. And he takes some of his sons and they go, and to retaliate for the sacking of Lawrence, he massacres some pro-slavery people. He just hacks them to death with hatchets and machetes. He is all about the violence. And he wants to start really a conflict with the South to initiate this bloodshed that will wash slavery away from the nation. He thinks, we have to just fight it out and get it over with. And to that end, in 1859, Brown ends up leading a assault on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is deep in the South, deep in a slave state. And the goal of this is to try to kick off a violent rebellion. He's hopeful that he will, he gets some support from Northerners. He gets some secret support to lead this charge. He's hoping to gain some weapons and just kick off really a brutal conflict. And he's hoping that once he successfully gets control of this arsenal, that he will be able to use the weapons there to just arm a anti-slavery assault against the nation. He will be able to sort of lead an uprising. He's hoping that news of this will spread. It will lead to massive slave insurrections, and the rivers of blood will flow and wash the sin of slavery out of the nation. However, John Brown is not successful in this attempted assault against this federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He's not the most organized. It's kind of a bad plan, actually. It's a federal arsenal, so it's guarded by Marines. And he doesn't have that many people with him. And a lot of his supporters are killed and captured. Brown himself is captured. He's put on trial. He's executed. He does become a bit of a martyr for the North, for the anti-slavery cause. Here is a man who gave his life for what he believed in. But the South really, this sets them off. They're thinking, how dare you? How dare Northerners secretly, see, there were some high-ranking abolitionists that secretly fund this. How dare you try to incite violence against other states? Like, this is an action of a hostile foreign nation, not a fellow state in a country. So it's further driving a wedge between the regions, the North and the South. The South is horrified. It's like you could have started a slave insurrection. Who knows how many people would have died in that? You would have killed innocent white families were at risk here. How in the world could Northerners do this? So a lot further sectional divide after the attempted assault by John Brown. Some people believe that this is kind of the beginning of the Civil War, where you had an assault on a federal arsenal. He was kind of trying to start a civil war, so maybe this is the real beginning of it. It certainly doesn't make any friends in the South. All right, next question. Who was John Brown and what was his goal? And with stuff like this happening, with the South seeing what they feel to be assaults against their sovereignty and their institutions, you see there's a growth of a sentiment known as Southern nationalism. And what Southern nationalism is a real sentiment that the South is its own country, or it should be anyway. A sense of nationalism is always really defined as a sense of pride and distinction in one's nation, that you see your nation as a cohesive, separate entity. You're very proud of that nation. The borders are very distinct, And the South is indeed starting to see itself as that. Different from the North, its own country, it has its own economy, it has a different culture, different politics. It's very heavily Democratic, whereas the North is very heavily Republican. Um, and nationalism is a lot of times expressed with a desire to gain independence from a mother country or another entity. A lot of times, colonial nationalism will lead to an independence movement where a colonial possession or a certain section of a country will advocate for its own independence. They feel very alienated from a ruling king or president or leader and will advocate for independence for that region because they feel very distinct. And it's expressed in a number of ways. The South starts acting like it is its own country. They create a Southern national anthem. They make their own flag. That's not something people do when they're feeling united as Americans. Making your own flag and your own different national anthem. And eventually they'll make their own constitution. They'll have a Southern Confederate constitution for the Southern states. The South's even starting to try to make allies with foreign nations. That's a big no-no. Remember, the Articles of Confederation and a lot of the stuff with the Constitution, that was the job of the federal government. That's what they do. The federal government's in charge of foreign relations, not states. But the South, as an entity, as a group of southern states, they're starting to look around. They're trying to, make friends with other countries, and they're looking to maybe spread their influence around. So they're expressing it in a variety of ways. They're looking for new territory. Even there's a Southerner who leads an expedition to Nicaragua in an attempt to gain new slave territory down there. That's not a section of a country that feels very connected with the rest of it. And this is something that really shows that the South is headed towards creating its own nation. They're already doing a lot of things that a separate nation would do, things that the North has no part in. All right, next question. What is Southern nationalism and how is it expressed? But the real tipping point here is going to be the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln, who has been growing in popularity, is victorious and ends up winning the presidency. The election of 1860 is another kind of strange one, just like the one in 1828, the one where 1824 and 1828, the ones with Andrew Jackson, where there were a lot of people running, and in this case too, there are a lot of people running for office. And Abraham Lincoln is running as a Republican. There are a lot of other candidates. The Democrats actually choose Stephen Douglas, but he doesn't do so well. There are a couple other splinter parties and individuals that try to run. John Breckinridge is all about running on this platform of protecting slave property, so he, of course, does very well in the South. And Bell, he is a guy from Tennessee. Bell is he talks about keeping and preserving slavery, but he's a little bit more moderate, so he does well in his home state and kind of that those middle states areas. But in general, the Lincoln is kind of the choice candidate of the North. And because there are so many people running, it just like 1824, it spreads out who can get a majority. And Lincoln ends up winning in 1860. He is elected president in the 1860 election solely with the votes of the North. Part of it is because the South was a little spread thin with the different candidates they had. They had Douglas, who was seen as more of a Southern candidate, Breckinridge, obviously here on this map, and Bell. So Lincoln is able to win due to the South being kind of splintered between these candidates, but also a big, big thing here. How does Lincoln win this election? The North has a much higher population. They have more seats, the more electoral votes, and they have a lot more people. And solely on population, Lincoln wins the North, and by winning that, he wins the presidential seat. The South is horrified. Now, not only is there a guy in the White House that says he wants slavery to go away, but he got there because the North put him there. The South, there's plenty of Southern states where Lincoln was not even on the ballot because everybody knew he was not going to win down in the South. Nobody was going to choose him over Breckinridge, Bell, or Douglas. It was kind of a fight between those two in the South. The South feels that they are going to be very much hurt by this. They are terrified that Lincoln is going to take away their economy, and they're terrified that they will never be able to be fully represented again. A president that goes against everything they stand for was just elected by the North. They are absolutely 100% horrified that this is going to keep happening. They will never be able to control federal politics because they're just too small population-wise. How can they ever have someone who represents their best interests in office after this? So it's not just because Lincoln is anti-slavery. It's because they didn't have a say in electing the president. It didn't matter what they did, really. Maybe even if they all threw their lot in behind Breckinridge and they were a united front, they still don't see that as making a difference. There's just not enough people in the South. They see it as the North kind of looming over them, very tyrannical. It's going to be the North that decides everything from now on. What they say goes because there's more people up there. The South is pretty adrift, and they're very terrified that Lincoln or whoever comes after him, every president from now on will just be the president of the North because they have the high population, they have the votes. They get to decide who's the president, not the South. And the South is very upset about this. All right, next question. How did Abraham Lincoln win the election of 1860? Because this is so terrifying to the South, they feel that they need to strike out on their own and stand up for themselves because the federal government will never ever represent them again. They can't. They won't have enough people. And that's not acceptable to them. They appreciate democracy and they see that as not really mattering anymore. So immediately following Lincoln's election, seven southern states secede, which means leave the Union. So they declare themselves they're no longer part of the United States. Bye. And the first one to do that is South Carolina. This initiates the secession crisis, where a wave of southern states simply declare their independence, that they are a separate nation, no more United States, because they feel that this is necessary. The country will no longer ever represent their interests. Why should they stay part of the United States if it's not going to serve their purposes, if it's not going to adequately represent them? They see themselves definitely as following in the footsteps of their revolutionary forefathers who declared independence after Britain could no longer protect them or serve their best interests. Once a government becomes unfeeling, once it becomes something distant and not representative of the people it's supposed to support, it's time to declare one's independence. You read the Declaration of Independence, that's the language of it. They feel that they're simply following in the footsteps of their forefathers, that they are the very patriotic ones to emulate this, to support and protect themselves. So the first one, obviously, of course, here I put it down is South Carolina. A couple others jump in: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and I think there's a couple other ones, but seven of them, bye. They jump out. They're done. And they form the Confederate States of America, so the Confederacy, and that is considered its own nation, not part of the United States anymore. It is now a different political entity that can serve the interest of these southern states. All right. So, next question here before I forget. What caused the secession crisis and what was it? So, yeah, a lot of Americans in the North, they're horrified by this too. They're like, "Oh my goodness, states are leaving. This is the Union is fracturing." A lot of them value unity. They feel that either one on its own is going to be too weak to survive, that you need to stick together. So, keeping on with this, but this doesn't start the Civil War. This is not the official beginning of the American Civil War. It's a crisis. States are leaving. There is now a foreign nation down south there, the Confederacy. But what starts the Civil War? What actually starts the fighting, the shooting, the official war stuff? This is going to be the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. What's going on here? Well, after the secession crisis, things kind of sit. Everybody is very tense. And Abraham Lincoln is gonna see what happens. He's hoping to kind of lure these states back in with diplomacy and negotiation. He he doesn't want to scare any more states off because there are still a couple states, southern slave states, that stay in the Union after his election. It's just South Carolina and a couple of the others that just out right away. So things kind of sit. It's a very tense time period here. Lincoln's trying to negotiate. You have a whole other country down south now. States are declaring their independence. It's very fraught. But it finally bubbles over in April 1861 when Confederate forces end up attacking a federal military garrison in South Carolina known as Fort Sumter. It's pictured here. They see it as an affront to their independence to have a federal fort, part of the United States, which is now a foreign country, off their shore. They would also like to take possession of it because they're thinking, hey, we're independent. We would like to have this and make it part of our Confederate nation. They don't want it to be federal anymore. It's kind of this outpost of the federal government behind enemy lines now. So they attack it and they the shots are fired. It's considered the first shots fired of the Civil War. Lincoln ends up telling South Carolina and the Confederacy, he says, all right, there are American federal troops there, Northerners stationed there, and we're hoping to, leave them alone. Please don't attack them. The South is trying to get control of Fort Sumter. Lincoln wants to help out the federal troops that are garrisoned there. And the South says no. They say absolutely not. You're not rescuing these guys. You're not bringing them food or supplies or anything like that. You're not resupplying a federal fort behind in our new country. That's an affront to their pride. It's an enemy fort they're trying to take, and they simply don't want this federal fort blocking a port either. They want control over it. The South forces the federal troops there to surrender, and Lincoln decides that's the last straw. He simply cannot let a violent insurrection occur on federal property now. This is just a step too far. It's descended into more violence. There's shooting, there's an attack. The North has pride too. They're not going to just let this new country attack one of their forts. So a lot of disagreement over the control of Fort Sumter. Shots are fired. Lincoln ends up calling for troops to put down this insurrection in the South. This has gone far enough, and it ends up being a declaration of war. When Lincoln throws that down and says that was too much. We're now at war. Our goal is to put down this insurrection, bring these states back into the Union. When that happens, those last couple states that were kind of remaining neutral, those last couple southern slave states, end up throwing their lot in with the Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas join the Confederacy. And now it is a war between these different states, the North and the South. The country has broken in half and descended into a state of civil war. The goal of the North will be to bring the southern states back into the Union and put down the insurrection. The goal of the South is to sustain their independence and win it and become their own separate sovereign nation of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. Quiz question here. What is the significance of Fort Sumter? This is indeed the beginning of the Civil War. It is now officially a real fighting war between the states and between these two separate political entities now. The Confederacy, which is never really recognized by any other nations, but certainly recognizes itself, and the North, northern states like New York and Pennsylvania. And this is going to be, without a doubt, the bloodiest thing the United States has ever been involved in. John Brown said that the sin of slavery could only be washed away with a river of blood, and he's certainly going to get it. The Civil War is absolutely brutal. Without a doubt, the most brutal thing the United States has ever involved in, highest body count of any war, more so than every war the United States has ever been in combined. Put the Revolution, World War I, World War II together, and it still doesn't crack how many people are going to die in the American Civil War. So, hope I am enticing you well for the next lecture when we are indeed going to cover the fighting of the Civil War.